Okay.
Hi.
Well, it's so much fun to be here to interview my friend Paulette Alden. And we're so delighted that Michael chose your book, The Empty Cell, for the one book, one chain of islands book, because everyone should read this book.
Thank you.
I'll just introduce us really briefly and then you could fill in anything
All
I
right.
left out.
All right.
So Paulette was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford, and she taught fiction and memoir for many years at the University of Minnesota, and she also is well known for teaching writing workshops through the Key West Literary Seminar. She has written two short story collections, you correct me if any of this is wrong,
All right.
and one memoir and a novel called The Answer to Your Question Before the Empty Cell. Now, how many years did you work on this?
I don't know exactly how many, but I think I started around 2011. But I published two other books in between then, and it wasn't a straightforward
Yes,
process.
they're usually not.
Definitely
Oh, and I forgot
not.
to say, I'm Roberta Islet,
Yes, please.
also known as Lucy Burdett, the author of the Key West Food Critic Mysteries, and happy to be the president of the Friends of the Library this year. So the reason why I wanted to know is that we've been friends for a while,
Yes.
and as a writer will talk about their book and say, oh, this is happening, and we have to go to Louisiana to do this, because your husband was very helpful to you with this book. And I'm just thinking, oh, la, la, she's working on a book. And then when I read it, I said, wow, that is a complicated and wonderful book. So maybe you could start by telling us a little thumbnail of what they're in for, what the book's about.
All right. I will start by saying that I was born and raised in Greenville, South Carolina, and after I left for college, I came back periodically to see my parents, and I would always mess around in the library. And one time I found a piece by the famed British author Rebecca West in the library. The New Yorker had sent her to Greenville in 1947 to cover the lynching and trial of a young black man named Willie Earl. And 28 cab drivers were acquitted at trial for that lynching. And I had never heard of this growing up in Greenville, and I was shocked and fascinated by it. So that was the beginning of the book. And over a number of years, I began to think about writing a novel based on this, but I didn't want to write particularly about the facts of the case. They had been covered by other people pretty extensively. But I was interested in writing about four ordinary people who were impacted by what had happened in Greenville and what had happened to this black man who was taken from jail and beaten, stabbed, and shot to death. And so I began to think about characters and began to do some writing about the book. There are four main characters, really. One is one of the lynchers, Lee Trammell. One is a black woman who works as a maid and who had loved him as a child. And so she is totally,
Willie Earl.
yes, yeah, totally shocked as when she learned of his death. Another is a fictional prosecutor who's a gay, closeted man who comes out over the course of the book. And the other is Lawton, the prosecutor's daughter, who is young. She's 17 at the time of the trial and at the time of the lynching and then the trial. And she begins a sort of racial awakening over these incidents. And I follow all of these characters. It is complicated. I follow these characters to the beginning of the civil rights movement in Greenville, which was in the early 60s.
So did these four characters come to you all at once? This is sort of a writerly question, or did you start with one and then say, I need a different point of view? How did that work?
Well, I knew that one of the characters had to be one of the lynchers because I thought that was had to be the first chapter to just sort of get that story up front and then follow through the aftermath of it. And I was really interested in trying to capture what it would be like to be one of those lynchers. And I'm actually very fond of Lee because he's a mixed up character who's also, to me, kind of sympathetic. I have some empathy for him. And so I follow his trajectory. At first, he's just convinced, you know, he's part of the mob. This is what we want to do. This is great. And then over the course of the novel, he begins to have second thoughts about it. I also thought I should have a Black woman who had known Willie to get at the emotional impact of it, from someone who was Black and who had loved him and who was horrified, really. And she ends up leaving the South, as many Black people did, and she returns to Greenville. But I was interested in that. Why there's a gay prosecutor, I don't know exactly, except that was just the character that kind of came out. And then Betsy, I wanted to follow a person who was privileged and white and young, who begins to have this understanding of what Black people around her were going through during the Jim Crow era. The book is set in the Jim Crow era, and I was really interested in that, and I really learned a lot about that, even though I had grown up in it. I hadn't really, I only understood it on the periphery of my own life as I was young and growing up in Greenville. So coming back to Greenville and doing the book and really delving deeply into that era and doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of people, it was an enormous education for me.
Is there one of the characters you'd like to read? Give us a little snippet of? Or you can do more than one.
Thank you. Let me see. I'll read a little bit about Alma. This is when she gets the news that it is Willie Earl who's been killed by this mob. Her mother calls her when she's at work, and this is her first reaction to it.
She's the character who was fond of Willie Earl.
Yeah, she knew him when she was 10 years older than him, and they lived as neighbors out in the country, and he was her first baby kind of when she was a little girl, and they grew apart, but she loved him. And so this is the section where she gets the news. This is her mother who calls her at work. They saying it was them taxi drivers, her mama was saying, broke him out of the Pickens jail, say he killed one of theirn, and that's why they got him. Alma wanted to shout that little Willie wouldn't kill anyone, but she didn't really know him anymore. Du'll bring y'all out to the house tonight. We got to go over and pay our respects to Tessie, see how we can help. In a daze, Alma hung up the phone. Could Willie have killed a white man? She'd heard things about him, head-shaking things, how he had come to no good. Mama had told her about Willie's fits, heard it from Tessie, how he would fall to the floor and Tessie would have to put a spoon in his mouth to keep him from swallowing his tongue. Alma got herself up and went down to the basement to her bathroom, took her washcloth from the rack there and bathed her face with cold water. She was breathing hard and fast, dizzy-headed. Little Willie. Horror was creeping over her, making her weak-kneed. She fell to her knees right there on the linoleum floor, locked her hands into fists, pressed them hard against her lips. Please, Jesus, she prayed fervently. Help Willie, Jesus, wherever he is. Hold him in your arms, dear Jesus. Take away his pain. Help us, Jesus. Help us to bear this. Not our will, but thine be done. A heavy weight was spreading in her, such that she felt she might not be able to rise. Alma used the sink to hoist herself to her feet. She leaned her weight against the porcelain bowl. She glanced in the tarnished mirror over the sink and saw an expression on her face that made her look away. She opened her mouth wide to unlock her jaw, took a deep breath, and drank a full glass of water. It was no different from any other glass, except that no white person would use it.
So that brings up a question that I'm sure you've asked yourself many times, which is, what is a white woman doing writing this book? And how did you struggle with that? And have you heard feedback about it?
I haven't actually heard feedback. I'm expecting it at any minute because I'm aware of that issue. Alma is one of the main point of view characters, a Black woman. The others are white, but there are other Black people in the book. But writing out of her perspective when I was writing the book, I didn't really think about that at all. I didn't really care. And I just was so interested in writing the story and in writing the book. And so any considerations of how that would be received were outside of my concerns. But it was when I started to think about going public and having it published that I began to think about the issues of appropriation and counterculture and all of that sort of
Right,
thing.
which has been such a big issue in the
has
last
been.
year and a half.
So I had to start thinking about that and doing some reading about it. And I was very interested in the controversy around American Dirt, which was criticized greatly in some camps and supported in others. And some people, the people who are Mexican or in the Latin culture, really felt that that was appropriation and really resented it. But I don't feel that any human experience belongs to any certain group. And I felt that my own relationship to Alma, this character, was empathetic and sympathetic and respectful. And I hoped that I did her well. And I felt that I'm not saying that I could ever know what it's like to be a Black person, but I did grow up in the Jim Crow era. We had a maid. I knew, Black people like Alma. And so I don't know, it was just important for me to try to represent that.
That was another question I had was Betsy
Yes.
grew up in this, not even middle class, it was more than middle class.
A little bit more, yeah.
Home
Mhm.
with a maid
Yep.
and a cook. And was that what it was like for you in Greenville when you were growing up?
We always had a maid. That's what we call them. We always had a Black woman who came in and helped with the children, helped with the housework, did the cooking. It was very common for people of a certain class. We weren't upper class. We were kind of between middle and upper, I guess you would say. But, so we were raised partly by Black women. And that's very typical of a lot of Southern people of my generation. And there are always these attachments and these emotional bonds between those people. But we were not raised to think of Black people as equal to us. It wasn't that we were taught to discriminate against them. It was just that we were in this environment where there were two groups that didn't mingle. They stayed with their own groups, and they had certain rules and certain prohibitions and restrictions. And we were aware of that, but only it was never talked about, and it was never questioned or challenged. It was the fabric of life. And when I was in high school this was in 1964, by then the civil rights movement had slowly begun to come to Greenville. And there was opposition, as there was all over the South. And I can remember how in 1964, rather than integrate the municipal swimming pool, they changed it into a seaquarium and put sea lions in it. And I remember being outraged by that, but I don't remember anybody that I knew or my parents talking about it or questioning it. It was just, it was just part of the Greenville city at that point. So it took a long time before Greenville was integrated too.
And I can remember talking with you about two movies, The Help and The Green Book, which I liked both of them.
Yes.
And you liked neither of them. And it maybe has to do with.
I think I liked The Green Book.
Okay.
And I thought the movie The Help was pretty good. I loved Viola Davis. I didn't like the novel The Help particularly, but not for the reasons you might expect. I thought that the white women were terribly stereotyped in an unfair way, and they weren't like any of the white women I knew. But to talk about race in the South is also to talk about class. And
Right.
So, the white women I knew who had maids were nice women, and they tried to treat their maids nicely, but they would never have, for instance, paid them more than everybody else was paying their maid. I mean, it was that kind of structure. But I thought the help was sort of, I don't know. I thought it was valuable in that it did shine a light on what Black maids experienced. I think it was set later. It was not in the, I think it was set in the 60s or 70s. I don't remember. But anyway, that was my objection to the help. I thought the movie was pretty good. And the Green Book I thought was good. And just recently in Greenville, there was an article in the paper about the Green Book that noted the places in Greenville where you could stay if you were traveling, which was really interesting.
Huh.
So this history in Greenville is still coming up and still being acknowledged and exposed, and it's good.
And has there been any reaction in Greenville to this novel?
There's been a positive reaction, but no negative reaction. But I'm not sure any Black people have read it or would be interested in it. I just don't know. And, you know, the kind of reaction I've gotten is invited to some book clubs, and there was an interview on TV and that sort of thing. So that's about all I know about that.
But you did a lot of research to get these people right. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, I did a tremendous amount of reading because I had to educate myself about everything, and about Greenville and, you know, newspaper reports and about the Willie Earl case. And then I tried to interview as many people as I could who knew about Greenville back in the 50s, and also the people who were involved in the sit-ins at lunch counters in the early 60s, because I had intended originally to end the book after the trial. That was as far as I could see originally. And then I began to think, I'm not going to leave these characters in a dark hole. You know, I'm gonna go on and show how things began to gradually move forward, not in a dramatic, huge way, but these smaller things. And so eventually, I do get to the lunch counter sit-ins, and I did interview wonderful people who's participated in that, and I'm still friends with a couple of them because we just enjoyed meeting each other and having those conversations. So, but one thing I'll say about research is that I did a ton of research and I threw a ton of it out, because as you know, one thing about writing a book is what do you put in and what do you leave out. And I got totally interested in the history of Greenville and the history of civil rights in Greenville. And eventually I just had to leave a lot of it out because I had to concentrate on a story.
Moving
and
the story
characters
along, right.
And people who were on a trajectory that was going somewhere. So I did learn a lot, but I had not done that much research for a book, and I was surprised at how much you discard.
Yeah.
You can't tell though when you're going in.
No, you don't know what you're going to need.
No.
So will you read us another character a little bit?
Let's see.
I like Lawton
Oh,
particularly.
I just skipped over him.
Don't skip over him.
Okay. Lawton was a closeted gay who was a fictitious prosecutor at the trial.
And he did not know he was gay, really, did he?
He had suppressed it very, very deeply, and he wanted to deny it. And in fact, that's a good segue into this section, because when he was in college, he had a crush on another college student there at USC, and he really fell in love with him, and they had one sexual encounter. And this is the aftermath of that. The next morning while he's in college, something utterly unfamiliar had taken him over. It was as if he were someone he didn't know, but at the same time, he had never felt so truly himself. Harry rose to embrace him again. They kissed, cupping each other's faces. Harry Baumgarten. Nothing had ever been so right to Lawton. The next morning he woke with a hangover. He was horrified. What had happened? What had he done? He leapt from bed, his heart hammering in terror. Harry was a faggot, a fairy, a homosexual, and he tried to make Lawton into one. But Lawton wasn't one. He was normal. He wasn't like Harry. Harry had seduced him, and Lawton hated him for it. He hated him. He felt repelled by what had happened between them. He couldn't understand it or explain it. Harry had made him do it. Yet even as Lawton hated him, he longed for him. His misery was as intense and as profound a mystery as his joy had been the night before. He told Garrett and Clem he had to finish an incomplete in order to graduate. He wouldn't be playing bridge anymore. They looked at him questioningly, sensing something but not knowing what. He went to the library that night, sure Harry would show up for the game. He plotted how he could get through the rest of the term, only 2 weeks left, without seeing him. Lawton never wanted to lay eyes on Harry again. When Harry came knocking on his dorm door, Lawton hid inside, holding his breath, waiting until he gave up and moved away. Harry shoved notes under the door, beseeching Lawton to talk to him. They twisted his heart, but he burned them. He made sure he didn't go anywhere he thought Harry might be. At graduation, his parents beaming in the audience, Lawton threw his hat up in the air with a special vehemence. It was shortly thereafter that Lawton met Lydia at the garden party. He had gotten so far off track that she could be his salvation. She was everything he should want. She would correct his path. Her parents, Beatrice and Lyman, were confident that they knew exactly what was what in the world. They never questioned themselves, their place, or their values. Lawton fell for them as much as for Lydia, their big house on Crescent Avenue with the fountain and the English garden, the portraits of Lydia's illustrious ancestors on the dining room walls, the formal dinner served by young Macy, the sense that if he just became one of them, life would unfold with no disturbances like Harry Baumgarten. He would take his place in the rightful order of things with Lydia, Beatrice, and Lyman to show him the way. He was in love with Lydia, he told himself. Lydia was everything he was supposed to want. But his thoughts would go to Harry, to images of his face, his hands, how he'd thrown back his head, and his mouth would twist to the side when he laughed. He would berate himself, tell himself how disgusting Harry was. But his harsh thoughts would melt into feelings of tenderness and desire. He would remember how Harry moved his hand up to his cheek and kissed the inside of his palm. He played that moment over and over in his mind, unable to help himself. He and Lydia moved through the years, newlyweds and then new parents. He settled down into the solicitor's office. With the financial help of Lydia's parents, they bought a house a few blocks from them on Crescent, so Lydia could be near them. Betsy became their focus, and they had, by all accounts, a good life. Lawton congratulated himself that he had righted himself, had achieved what anyone would consider success. He never told anyone about Harry, but he never forgot him either.
So he's got a ways to go.
He's got a ways to go.
So how did you balance the 4 characters? I've never written anything except from one point of view. When I've tried, it's been difficult.
It is difficult.
And I was always told by editors, every time you switch a point of view, you run the risk of losing your readers because they're attached to the one that they're reading about. So tell us how you manage that.
Well, I wanted the story to encompass more than one character's experience, and I knew that I wanted to show it from different angles and different perspectives. And I originally wrote the characters each in self-contained segments that were whole. And so then when I decided that I had to go through to the civil rights movement, I had to go back and break those up to braid them together, which was really difficult. But certainly changing chapters, and there are many, many books that are written with, varying point of view characters in various chapters. And so, but I did have to struggle to, get one character's trajectory going here and then come in with another one and keep everything going forward and keep track of time. But, characters are distinctive and readers can follow it, especially if they're chapters that,
Right, and you're not using these people like cardboard characters to move them through the story.
No.
They each have a very powerful internal struggle. Each of them does.
Yes, they do. I think that's true. And that's what I was hoping people would be interested in. And they're all connected in that they all are reacting to this original event that affected each of them, but they're very different people, and they are affected very differently. They're each, in my mind, struggling to find their own form of freedom. And so they're each locked up in their own cell, so to speak, and they're each trying to find some way out of that. But they're different cells, shall we say.
Which, speaking of cells, then tell us about the title, The Empty Cell, and where that came from and how that shows up in the book.
I thought of The Empty Cell because Betsy, one of the characters, the young woman, is so affected when she goes with her father, the prosecutor, to interview the jailer, and she sees the cell that Willie Earl has been taken from, the empty cell where he was ripped out and taken away to be tortured and killed. And that affects her a great deal. And that's a kind of running motif through the book, because Betsy begins to identify with being taken from the cell. She dreams about it, and she sees her things in the cell, and she begins to feel this emptiness of the cell, as if she's the one who's been taken. That's a sort of motif that runs through the book. And that's sort of where the title came from, but it also came through just in feeling like each of these characters. Lawton is certainly locked in the cell of his own repression, and Lee has his conscience to deal with, and he's locked in, he's bound, as he says himself. And Alma is locked in by being Black in the South, and realizing, her whole life she's had to hold down rage, anger, fear, terror, and she goes to New York to try to escape that. So those are kind of the cells, although they're not named in the book as that, but in my mind that was something to do with the title.
It works together wonderfully. Do you want to say anything else before I ask you about self-publishing?
Not in particular. I would say one thing that people ask me sometimes is about change. And, this is a grim period in the South. And it's surprising to me that it's become timely in a way that I never expected when I was writing it. I wrote it over many years. And since the George Floyd death and the coming to consciousness for a lot of people of how we have a racist society. And so I didn't think about that at the time, but when people ask me, have there been any changes? What's it like now? And I always say, when I was growing up, it was totally segregated. You would never have gone out to lunch with a Black person. They wouldn't have had Black TV reporters or, and now Greenville is integrated to that extent. But that's not to say that there aren't still racial problems there, and there's not still the whole thing that we're uncovering now, again, in America in terms of the racist system and structure of the country.
And maybe each time we run into it, we get a little deeper down. It feels that way this time.
We get deeper down. I totally agree with that. Whether we move forward or not, I'm not sure.
Right.
That's what I wonder about. We'll see.
Yeah.
I lived in Minneapolis for almost 40 years, and so I'm watching the Derek Chauvin trial with great interest, because that tore the city up and it's changed it forever. So it's a different city than I left 4 or 5 years ago. Self-publishing?
Yes. So how did you choose that, and what was the experience like?
It chose me. I did try to get it published through, regular channels, which would have been much easier, although there would be some disadvantages to that too. Because one thing about self-publishing is you have total control over everything, and you could say control to fail. But I liked some aspects of it, but I couldn't get it published through regular channels.
Which is, why do you think that was?
There are a lot of gatekeepers, and the first gatekeepers are agents, and I didn't have an agent. And a lot of publishing is about money, and it's about having a book that they're convinced will sell.
Absolutely.
And that is involved with having a track record, which I didn't really have, having a name that people will recognize so they will be able to sell your book. I think my age had a lot to do with it. I'm 73, and they are looking for young people who have up and coming, careers going for them. What else? Let's see. I think that about covers
And
it.
it's a difficult subject matter. It's not.
It is.
It's not something easy.
No, it is not. And they would have been taking a chance on it. The first chapter does have the N word in it because it's from Lee, one of the lynchers, and he would not have said, let's go to Pickens and get that colored guy out of jail, or let's get that Negro out of jail. He was going to use the N word, and there was just no getting around that for me. And that would have been, a difficult thing for them.
Right.
They would have
And I
had
should say, for the people who were thinking about reading it, I knew I needed to read it. I had to read it because it was your book. But because this year has been so hard, I was not reading hard things. I was reading things that helped get me through before I went to bed at night. And then when I read it, I said, "Oh, this is a wonderful book."
Thank you.
But there was that hump to get over that they may have run into as well.
I think that's a great point. Not everyone wants to, start their bedtime reading about a lynching, but if you go beyond that, the book is not totally dark.
No, it's about these people,
Yeah.
that's the heart of it.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. As far as self-publishing, what else?
So tell us about the cover.
Oh, I happen to love the cover myself. This is an image of Willie Earl that was a mugshot that we got from the Greenville Police Department.
That you might not even notice, but it's in the tree.
Yeah, it's very, what would you say? Very layered and very abstract in a way. And I hired the best cover designer I knew of, and she's in New York. She's a wonderful cover artist who's done a lot of books. I paid big bucks for it because I was determined that the book was going to look as good as any book that you could buy in the bookstore by Houghton Mifflin or somebody like that. Whether I succeeded at that, I don't know. But I just wanted to do the best job I could with it, and in a way that was honoring it too. I just didn't want it, not to have the best treatment that I could give it. The trouble with self-publishing is that you can't promote your book very well. It's just very difficult to get the word out and to get, the public to know about it. To get reviews is almost impossible unless you know somebody. My earlier novel, the answer to your question, is that it?
That's it.
Thank you. I'm friends with Scott Turow because we were at Stanford together, and he blurbed that book. And so there was his blurb on the front cover, and that sold a lot of books. I mean, some books for a self-published book, but I didn't have anybody or anything for this book like that. So, you start out kind of down in a hole, I'd say.
And as far as editing, things that the publisher would have done, you made sure you got that for yourself.
I hired editors. I hired, content editors, and then I hired copyright editors, and I also hired interior design people too, which I really liked because I just, most people probably won't notice too much about that, but I did. So I was the publisher, I was the writer, and I've sort of not been a great promoter, but that's the saga.
Well, hopefully people out here will read like mad and tell their friends.
Well,
but let's probably finish, and you want to read something, a last bit for us?
I'd like to read toward the end of the book because this is so important to me, because in a way this was where the book was heading all along. But this is in 1960, so we've come from the lynching in 1947 up to 1960. And this is when Lawton, the prosecutor, is at his office on New Year's Day, 1960, and he's thinking about, this is the first day of a whole new decade, the 60s, and I'm going to start a little further into this. And this is at Court Square. If you go to Greenville, South Carolina now, you will see the courthouse. There's a wonderful bookstore in the courthouse called M. Judson, which is kind of nice. But Court Square also has the Poinsett Hotel, these old distinguished brick buildings there, the Chamber of Commerce building and the courthouse. And here he is in his office in the Chamber of Commerce building. He stands at the window overlooking Court Square. Down below, Main Street is deserted except for a Negro man riding a bike toward Broad Street and an inebriated white couple walking in a not very straight line with their arms around each other. Across the square, the solemn courthouse gazes back at him. At the Poinsett Hotel next door, the guests are no doubt recovering from last night's reveries. A brightly colored party hat blows across the sidewalk and is gone. It's snowing lightly. Everything here is history, he thinks. From the Cherokees who roamed these parts to the founding of the village on the banks of the Reedy in the 1780s to the mill villages that make Greenville the textile capital of the world, up to this very day. On January 1st, 1960, history is still being made here in Greenville, in South Carolina, and all over the South. Greenville is still being made. From his desk, he picks up a mimeographed flyer Huff Stone dropped off last week. Written at the top in capital letters, it reads, "March to Greenville Airport that democracy may fly." On October 25th, Jackie Robinson, Reverend J.S. Hall, and others were threatened with arrest for sitting in the white waiting room of the Greenville, South Carolina airport. The Greenville Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance and the Committee of Racial Equality, CORE, along with the state conference of the NAACP and others, are calling you to a statewide Emancipation Day protest and march on Greenville Airport. January 1st, 1960, 12:30, meet at Springfield Baptist Church. Remember, democracy depends on you. There's a cheery knock and Betsy comes in the outer office door. He goes out to greet her. "Hi, Daddy," she says, hanging her coat on the coat rack. "Happy New Year." "And to you, honey," he says, giving her a hug. "My old desk," she runs her hand lightly over it, "and that awful desk chair. It's yours if you want it," Lawton says. "Thanks, Daddy." She gives him a rueful smile. "Come in my office," he says. "I want to show you something." He hands her the flyer and waits while she reads it. "Mother told me about the march," Betsy says. "Huff is going." "So I've heard. Come here." He motions her over to the window. "I want you to see." Betsy joins him. All is quiet on Main Street below. The flurries have changed to light sleet. A yellow cab drives slowly by the Poinsett. A man with a black umbrella passes in front of the courthouse. When her father doesn't speak, she gives him a questioning look. "It may look the same out there," he says, still looking out the window, "but it's not." He's silent for so long, she turns to him. "They're marching in Greenville today, Betsy, and after today, there'll be no turning back." A shiver runs through her. It's the past he's seeing, and the future.
Well, this has been really fun.
It has been. Thank you so
And
much,
we thank
Roberta.
the world's most beloved librarian, Michael Nelson, for setting it up.
And thank you to the Key West Library and the Monroe County Libraries for sponsoring this.
And everyone read it. Read the book. It's a
Yeah,
wonderful book. It's a good book club book too.
It is a
There's
good-
a lot to discuss.
Oh, and I'm putting some questions for book clubs on my website.
And you might even go on Zoom
I
with
could.
book clubs
I
if they
could.
ask you.
You are the promoter. I'm hiring her.